Thursday, May 18th, 2017. The time, 12:56 a.m.
Detroit 911. What is the address of the emergency?
1777 3rd Street, the MGM Casino.
And the callback number?
313-465-1100. What did they say?
Tell me exactly what happened.
I have a non-responsive guest in a hotel. It's going to be a 50-year-old male inside of room 1136.
Okay, non-responsive. He's not breathing?
No.
Is anyone doing CPR?
They're getting up there. Did they start CPR? Okay, so they found out that the guest was attempting to hang himself, so they're trying to get him down so they can assist with CPR.
Okay, I'll request units.
Okay, can I get your operator number, please?
19.
Thank you very much.
Subsobers, there is no possible world, including this one, especially this one, in which I would accept the official narrative of what happened to Chris Cornell as being factual. There are so many things about it that raise so many red flags. With all the similarities as to what happened with him and Chester Bennington and Avicii, I just felt like it was time to talk about Chris Cornell. And what really got me started down this whole rabbit hole was this single post about these three guys and Anthony Bourdain all being involved in this Silent Children documentary. We dove a little bit more into it with the Chester Bennington episode, and now we finally come to a place where we got to see how these things are all tying together. Really, I wanted to find out whether these guys were tied to this project. And as we saw with the Chester Bennington episode, Linkin Park definitely was tied to this project. Avicii, though I couldn't really find any evidence that he was tied to this specific project, he was very outspoken about human trafficking, as we saw in his For a Better Day video. And as I continued digging into it, so many more eerie coincidences and connections, even more than just the Silent Children project, popped up. It became so overwhelming that it was hard to ignore. And then when you look at all the details about what happened to Chris Cornell, it just leaves you even more confused, curious, and really just kind of scared for what really is going on. But I think the biggest and most obvious connection is the fact that they all chose to self-exit at a time when they were all said to be doing well mentally. And just like the last couple stories I've done, the same is true for our story today. Chris had immense struggles with addiction that lasted throughout a majority of his career, and the similarities between these guys' journeys and then ultimately what happened to him just leaves way too many questions for me, or really a lot of people, to feel satisfied. So that's why I wanted to dig into Chris Cornell's story today and figure out what the Geff is going on here. And with that super lame joke,
let's go.
Welcome back to Sobering Stories with me, DJ Petrovski. And that actually leads us directly into our sponsor for today, because today's sponsor is someone who has tremendously supported the channel without even knowing it. So on my Instagram page over the last few months, my name on there is at DJ Petrovski with a V, Petrovski. And there's a DJ from like somewhere in South America or Mexico, I'm not really sure. His name is DJ Petrovski with no V. Very similar, very difficult to distinguish the two. But because of that, I have gotten probably at least 100 new followers on my Instagram. These are all people who think they're following DJ Petrovski. They tag him at his concerts and his shows, and then they end up actually tagging me. So I've gained a lot of support from DJ Petrovski, and I wanted to try and return the favor. So you guys should go out and you should follow DJ Petrovski, Petrovski, no V, and show him some love, because, well, his fans have been showing me some love, not even knowing it.
Come here, rude boy, come here, rude boy.
And while you're at at it, you might as well follow DJ Petrovski as well. In fact, you probably will end up following me first because that's what everybody else seems to be doing when you search for him. I don't know. Let me know what happens. Drop it in the comments. Business item number 2. I have a second channel with my brother called We Subscribe. You guys should check it out. I've got a playlist in my playlist section. It's got all of our We Subscribe videos, but it'll take you to that page. I'll also link it in the description. But you should follow it. Those are funny videos. Our channel, We Subscribe, is a subscription for subscribers who understand and appreciate the value and importance of subscribing and what it means to be a subscriber. So if that's you, then definitely go check it out. And help those videos get pushed. Business item number 3. If you haven't seen the Avicii and Chester Bennington episodes, then I highly recommend going back and watching those maybe before this one, just because some of the information does tie in together, and it'll give you some backstory on some things that I probably won't go back over in this one. I'll link them in the cards and in the description. Now that we got all the business items out of the way, let's get down to business. Christopher John Boyle was born on July 20th, 1964. His parents were Karen Cornell and Edward Boyle. It said that he grew up, he had 5 siblings, he had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and his dad was fairly abusive, and it said that he actually beat on the kids pretty hard. It sounds like it turned Chris into a fairly shy and insecure youngster. He really seemed to struggle socially. However, in true fashion, like most of my other stories, he found solace in music, and at the age of 7, started playing piano, so a little late, bro. Everybody else is starting at 5. But Chris started playing piano at the age of 7 and just really fell in love with music and just really wanted to pursue that passion. And because he was so introverted and shy, it kind of made sense. It was something he could do on his own. He didn't have to be in front of people. He didn't have to interact with people. And it was something that he really enjoyed. Also in typical fashion, Chris Cornell started using drugs and other substances by the age of 12, which is when I started. Chris just felt like this was a perfect escape for him from the difficulties of his life at home. By the age of 14, his parents would finally get divorced, and Chris was so bitter towards his dad that he actually changed his last name to Cornell, which is how we know him now as Chris Cornell, instead of Chris Boyle, which is probably for the best. However, even though his dad was abusive and not necessarily the best role model or father figure to him, it still caused a lot of internal turmoil for him, and obviously it sent him feeling even more abandoned than he was before. By the age of 15, he was already seriously acting out, and he even dropped out of school. But it's at this point that Chris actually decided to dive headfirst into learning how to drum. He was heavily influenced by bands like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, and he wanted to expand his musical tastes and his musical knowledge, and it seemed like he was further diving into this musical passion he had. Chris got decently good at the drums, and he decided that he really wanted to try and work with a band and start trying to get into the music industry. So he started performing with local bar bands and just kind of getting hired as a drummer for different bands. But he really just didn't like the fact that he had no control over the music or the sound that they were playing. He was just drumming somebody else's music. He was beating to the tune of somebody else's drum. Kind of. Anyways. And Chris really knew what he wanted from his music. He really knew the direction he wanted to go. And really the only way to do what you want as an artist or a musician is, well, to start your own band, do your own thing. So that's exactly what he did. At the time, he was living with a couple of guys, Kim Tail and Hiro Yamamoto, and they decided to form a band. Chris started out as the drummer of the band, but because he had such an amazing voice, the guy had a 4-octave voice. He could go up and down 4 octaves, which is more than the typical 2 to 3 that most artists can do. But Chris, he pushed boundaries, and he had the ability to push that like 80s kind of hairband, high-pitched, metal screaming kind of a voice that they had, and also bring in that, what would end up becoming that low, grungy, dark vocal aspect to it. So I don't know, it's hard for me to describe, but I think if you guys have ever listened to Chris Cornell or Audioslave or Soundgarden, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Up until this point, he had worked as a line cook and a dishwasher, just kind of trying to get by, really, trying to find his place in this musical world. But he knew his end goal was to be a musician. And by the time he formed this new band with his roommates, he figured, this is going to be my full-time thing. We're going to make this work. And they started just playing anywhere and everywhere they could and just trying to get their music and their sound out there. Chris actually was going to be the singing frontman. And Phil Collins is the real OG when it comes to drumming and singing. But Chris really wanted to step away from the drums, and he decided to teach himself how to play guitar because it made more sense for him as the frontman to be on the guitar. And he did. And he was really good at it, shoot. So by 1984, these guys had formed the band Soundgarden, which I'm sure most of you guys know who they are. They started working on just honing in on their sound, honing in on their crafts as, musicians, and working on just playing local shows and really just getting their name out there as a band. And they were doing a great job. And it was a huge break for them when a young lady named Kimberly Warnick, who worked for a local radio station, had a few artists that she really liked in the local Seattle area. And as most of you guys know, music is fairly centralized to either like New York or LA, but there's not a lot of music coming out of Seattle, especially at this point in time. But Kimberly sends this demo tape with a few bands on there, and she titles it Bands That Will Make You Money. And she sends it off to this young lady named Susan Silver, who is a music manager in the Seattle area. And she immediately falls in love with Soundgarden, as well as a couple of other artists that are on that tape. And she immediately knew that she was hooked. She knew she had to get these guys a record deal, and she was really working hard to find them shows and just get these guys to blow up. And it sounds like she really enjoyed Chris Cornell as well, because eventually in 1990, the two of them would get married, and they'd stay married until 2004. Up until 1988, Soundgarden had released 2 EPs, Screaming Life and Fop. And in 1988, they released their very first debut studio album, and that was called Ultra Mega OK. And it was actually nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Metal Performance. So it did really well right out the gates. And with all this success, obviously huge labels were hitting them up, trying to sign them to big deals. But Chris and the bandmates did not want to sign to a major record label. Number one, it went against the whole kind of grunge alternative rock scene that they were in. It was more of an independent label kind of a scene, underground, and it would have been a slap in the face to the audience if they did. But they also just wanted to avoid the pitfalls of the music industry. Like we talk about every week here, they had a feeling that if they sold out to a music industry or a record label, then they wouldn't be able to make music that they wanted to make. They'd have to make music that somebody else wanted them to make. And they were likely right. But these guys were growing, and fast. And Sub Pop and SST, the labels they were on before, they were real small. They didn't have the financial resources or really just the ability to push out Soundgarden's music or get them to a bigger audience like they needed them to. So they had to entertain the idea of going with a bigger label. And one of the labels that offered artists more creative control was A&M Records. And because of what they offered, allowing them to keep their experimental metal kind of a sound, they decided to sign with them. And in 1989, they released their very first major studio album titled Louder Than Love, which was really, really well received. It did really well. It performed extremely well, and it actually eventually would go 2 times platinum. The band then released their breakthrough album, Bad Motorfinger, and it was well received, continued to build on the already massive success that they were seeing in the mainstream world. And with their recent deal with A&M Records, it kind of opened the door not only for them to enter the mainstream, but a bunch of other bands that were in the Seattle grunge scene as well. Ironically enough, in fact, they had opened the door so well for other bands that another grunge band from Seattle, Nirvana, released their Nevermind album in 1991, which actually outperformed Bad Motorfinger on the Billboard charts. Because of their success, they brought in other amazingly successful bands within the same genre, not necessarily the same sound. Then in 1994, Soundgarden would kind of reach its peak when they released Super Unknown, which was extraordinarily well received. It hit number 1 on the Billboard charts and had tons of singles on it, and to this day is still one of most people who listen to anything Chris Cornell, it's their favorite album to listen to. It's definitely an amazing album. It's got a lot of songs that most of you guys probably know: Black Hole Sun, Spoon Man, Fell on Black Days, and the album actually won them 2 Grammy Awards. So very well received album, and honestly, like I said, kind of the peak of their success. After this, in 1996, they would release one last album before finally disbanding in 1997. One of the main reasons that they split up was just creative differences. It was becoming increasingly difficult for them to make new music together. They were touring a lot, so they were all really kind of just overworked and exhausted. And I think that they were starting to hit a point where they realized they just wanted to go different directions. And I think one of the other things that contributed to that was in 1990 when Chris Cornell lost a good friend named Andrew Wood, and they started a tribute band called Temple of the Dog in order to pay tribute to him. It consisted of a few members of the Mother Love Bone band, as well as members of Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. It's kind of like a little super group. But one of the things that Chris realized in doing this was that his voice was one of the things that continued to bring people back. I think for Chris, it really highlighted how successful he was as a musician and how fans really truly appreciated what he brought to the table. And I think it gave him a little bit of an itch to kind of branch off and do his own solo thing and really test the boundaries of what Chris Cornell could do on his own with his lyricism and with just his voice in general. And one of the reasons for that was because Temple of the Dog was really only started as like a one song kind of a tribute to their friend. But people loved the band so much that they decided to actually produce a full album. The album didn't perform super well until Pearl Jam started to blow up later in that year. But after taking a couple of years off in 1999, Chris started his own solo project, just Chris Cornell, and he released his very first solo album entitled Euphoria Morning. I mean, all around people did like the album, but it was not nearly as successful and viral as Soundgarden was. One of the big things in the grunge scene at the time was, unfortunately, dope. These guys were getting pretty deep into it as well, and Chris was no exception. Not only was Chris drinking regularly, he was experimenting with a lot of other substances, but it was said that he was pretty heavily addicted to the black tar. And it got really bad, especially around this time with all the, dissolving of Soundgarden, him having to focus on a new solo career, solo touring. Everything was kind of on his own shoulders now. So he was really relying on those substances to keep him going. Just like we saw in many of my other cases in the past with like Juice WRLD and Mac Miller and Whitney Houston, using these drugs to keep them fueled to make this music industry happy. And after giving this whole solo thing a go, it seems like Chris was starting to realize that it was going to be a lot harder than he thought, or maybe he was having some creative struggles. And he was presented with an opportunity in 2001 to actually join a band. It'd be like a super group with former members of Rage Against the Machine. And they started this band called Audioslave. And they really wanted Chris to be the frontman for the band. They just loved his voice. He was notorious in the industry. And they were going to come up with this new metal kind of rock sound, and they just thought he'd be perfect for it. And for whatever reason, Chris was ready to get back into band life and be a member of a band again. So he decided to join up, and honestly, they were extremely successful. Over the next few years, they released multiple albums that were crazy successful and became one of the biggest names in rock music for a little while. Prior to starting up Audioslave, Chris actually had his very first kiddo with Susan Silver, who's the one that got them started in the music industry. And their daughter's name was Lillian Jean Cornell. This seemed to be a pretty significant piece of Chris's life, and one of the main reasons why he decided in 2003 that he needed to sober up. He said that he was just starting to become a family man. He had new values, new focus for his life, and he just really wanted to be a good example for his daughter. So in 2003, he admitted himself into rehab and got sober. After that, he managed to stay sober for the next 14 years. By 2004, Chris and Susan would actually get divorced, just for whatever personal differences, moving in a different direction. Not really sure. Maybe the struggles of having a baby. It is either going to make you stronger or it's going to break things, that's for sure. And it sounds like it broke things. But in that same year, he would actually meet Vicky, and they would get married that same year. The two of them would settle down and they'd have 2 more kids, Chris Cornell Jr. and Tony Cornell. By 2006, Audioslave had released 3 studio albums, all of which performed extremely well. And then after this, there's a pretty big break in any sort of anything from Chris Cornell. And what I would assume is likely he's diving into family life. He's working on his sobriety. He's just got a lot of other things besides music that he's focused on. And he's probably made a shit ton of money at this point. So he doesn't necessarily have to focus on making more music. So pretty much all the way up until 2010, Chris Cornell's really out of the limelight. But in 2010, he does release an acoustic solo album. And then in 2012, Soundgarden actually reunites and decides to start going back on tour and start working on new music. I remember very specifically when this happened because I had a friend at the time who was really into Soundgarden way back in the 90s. And when he found out they were coming back and starting to tour again, he got super stoked and bought some tickets right away. So I kind of remember that all happening. And then really the band wasn't doing a lot of new stuff. They were making new music, but it wasn't anything, too crazy. They weren't going wild, making tons of albums. And then in 2016 and 2017, they were actually just touring, just doing national, international tours. While Chris was getting back into music with Soundgarden, he was also simultaneously working on just these different humanitarian efforts and ways for him to be able to give back and use his massive platform for good. And especially with his addiction issues and with his history of being abused as a child, he wanted to focus on issues that really resonated with him. And so him and his wife, Vicky, actually started the Vicky and Chris Cornell Foundation. And the main focus of this foundation is helping people who have been stricken by homelessness and, more importantly, children who are in vulnerable positions. One of the main things that they seem to focus on worldwide is human trafficking. Now, this foundation was extremely active in trying to fight and raise awareness in terms of human trafficking and child exploitation. And because of this, it makes a lot of sense, actually, why people started connecting the fact that they might be involved with this Silent Children project. However, I personally couldn't find any direct evidence linking them to this project. What I did find, however, was that the Chris and Vicky Cornell Foundation was involved with an international justice mission foundation which operated in Moldova. Moldova is where the Silent Children trailer was actually filmed at, the one featuring Paul Myhill, where he talks about the traffic jam campaign and all those other things. So the fact that they were in Moldova working on human trafficking and working on fighting and raising awareness and working with another foundation even seemed like they might actually have had something to do with the Silent Children. It's just that it ended up shutting down. So maybe they don't have it posted anywhere. Maybe it's not able to be found anywhere. I'm not really sure. I was also able to find proof that Chris Cornell's foundation was responsible for financially backing another documentary. Not only did they fund this project, but Chris Cornell also wrote a song called The Promise for the movie. So mostly focused on the Armenian genocide, but it does cover topics like related to human trafficking because a lot of those things were happening during that time period because of this whole Armenian genocide. So kind of interesting. And I think because of those two factors, I think people were tying the fact that this other documentary, The Silent Children, was covering very similar topics and was also in a very similar area to where they were already at. So maybe they put those two together and just assumed that they were probably working on this Silent Children project. Also, the Traffic Jam campaign was entirely focused on getting musicians to speak out against human trafficking. Chris Cornell's foundation was already doing that, so to think that he wasn't involved with the project is kind of silly. Although it was hard for me to find any sort of evidence to prove that they were involved with it. So unfortunately, I really didn't. There's tons of posts that I found on the Cornell Foundation talking about how they donate guitars, they plan shows, they perform at different performances to raise awareness and raise money for these different causes. And one of the things that the Traffic Jam campaign did was called the Global Traffic Jam, where they would just put on this massive concert to raise money and awareness about human trafficking. I tried to find evidence that Soundgarden or Chris Cornell performed at said Global Traffic Jam, but I just couldn't find anything. That's something, maybe you guys can find something on it, but I couldn't. One of the other interesting connections that I found in my research was that the Cornell Foundation was also huge in the Haiti relief efforts. They actually partnered with another foundation that was working down in Haiti called Aid Still Required. And one of the big donors for the Aid Still Required Foundation is actually Bill and Hillary Clinton from the Clinton Foundation. So I thought that was kind of weird, especially after last week talking about Linkin Park and their connections to the Clintons down in Haiti and the programs and initiatives they started with the sustainable recycling solutions. So I don't know, it just had me thinking and had me wondering that all of these guys had some weird ties to the Clintons down in Haiti. And then in 2017, Vicky and Chris actually went over to Greece to help with the whole Syrian refugee crisis. And refugees can be extremely vulnerable to predators and human traffickers because these are people who are displaced and forced out of their homes. They're looking for refuge somewhere, and oftentimes that can be in a place that may not actually be safe. They might actually end up being sold into some sort of human slavery or some sort of human trafficking situation where they're just being exploited. And so Chris and Vicky were over there just raising awareness about it, and they were working with organizations like the International Rescue Committee and just trying to do their best to help out the best they could. One of the things they were really focused on was getting firsthand accounts and just talking with families and women and children who have been directly affected by this whole process. And so I'm sure through that whole experience, they were able to gather some serious understanding about some of the actual struggles they faced, especially when it comes to human trafficking and being exposed to and possible victims of this whole network. When I was looking into Greece and kind of their role in this whole human trafficking thing, I was able to find out, just like Oman from the Avicii episode, Greece is also listed as a tier 2 level risk for human trafficking, meaning it's still very prevalent and any of the policies and stuff they're putting in place are not actually doing anything to affect the numbers. So Greece is a very, very prevalent place for human trafficking to occur. The other thing it made me think of was something I found during my Isaac Kappy research for my Isaac Kappy video, and that was his dead man switch. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, it's basically if he turns up unalived, then he's got kind of like a security where this video is supposed to release that's supposed to expose certain things. And the video that he released, although I'm not sure how successful it was because it's very cryptic and kind of leaves people really more curious than anything, but he posted this video of all these young girls running around this really weird, I don't even know what this place is. It looks like it could be like a spa, maybe, not really sure what it is. Very beautifully made, crazy cool architecture, but there's all these little girls running around in like bathing suits and underwear, and it's just really strange. And some netizens have tracked that place down and found that it's actually someplace in Turkey. And Turkey and Greece are just separated by a sea, and they're both very, very prevalent places for human trafficking to occur because they both are just big hubs that move inwards into Europe, essentially. So the other thing about this whole dead man switch that I found to be very interesting was the whole black sun that is in the middle of this pedestal that these girls are crawling over. It very similarly resembles the black sun from the, German castles back from World War II. I don't know if you guys need me to put this together for you or not, but the Black Hole Sun song by Soundgarden, the black suns in here, I don't know. Maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's something. To give you an idea of where Chris's head was at this time, once he returned from Greece, he went back to his normal touring schedule, and in April of 2017, he actually embarked on his Higher Truth tour, which was a solo tour. He did play some Audioslave and Soundgarden songs during the whole set list, but it was mostly focused on promoting his Higher Truth album from 2015. And this just kind of gives you an idea. His Higher Truth was just being more outspoken on bigger issues. It just kind of shows that that's where his head was at. He was really focused on really speaking out and promoting and advocating for people who were less fortunate and using his platform for good, just like Chester Bennington and just like Avicii. On May 17th, 2017, he performed at the Fox Theater in Detroit, Michigan, and there's mixed reviews about the performance. Some people said that he was kind of slurring his words and seemed a little out of it, while other people said that everything was great. Videos of the performance actually seem like he was totally fine. Doesn't seem like there was any reason to be concerned.
Listen to Chris here right after he performs a song. Seems pretty upbeat.
Afterwards, he went outside, he signed some autographs, talked with some fans, and then at about 11:15, him and his bodyguard left the show at the Fox Theater and went back to his hotel at the MGM Grand. From here, things just get real messy, you guys. Starting with the fact that some sources say that right directly at this point, before they split off and went to their two separate rooms, Chris's bodyguard, for whatever reason, was holding on to his Ativan prescription and gave him 2 Ativan per request from Chris. Other reports say that the two left from this point, went back to their separate rooms, and then shortly after that, Chris actually was having some trouble, some reports say with his computer, having issues with his computer in some way, they don't specify what. Other reports say that he was having trouble with his Apple TV. Honestly, the Apple TV makes more sense to me because he was probably looking to just like chillax and Apple TV out, but you can't really do that if your Apple TV is not working. And if it's one where he actually brought the Apple TV with him and he was trying to plug it into their hotel TV and it wasn't working, that would make more sense. I'm not really sure exactly what the situation was. Nobody really does. The only person that does is Martin Kirsten, his bodyguard. He calls Martin Kirsten and says, "Yo, man, I need your help. I can't figure out either my computer or my Apple TV." So he walks 2 doors down to Chris's hotel room. He helps him out with whatever, the Apple TV or the computer. It sounds like what he did was he called down to the front desk to get their actual remote network access so that he could use that instead of just working off whatever the guest Wi-Fi was. I don't really understand completely, honestly, what he was trying to fix and how they fixed it. But it sounds like they fixed it. They got it figured out. And other reports say that this is the point when his bodyguard gave him the 2 Ativan. And then he left, went back to his hotel room and decided to turn on the TV, and his bodyguard was chilling out. Chris was chilling out. Roughly 20 minutes is all it took for this whole computer Apple TV situation to work itself out. At about 11:35, Vicky Cornell actually calls Chris and has a brief conversation with him in which she says that he just sounded really out of it and was giving her these vibes that she thought maybe he was using again, maybe he had relapsed or something. And he tries to reassure her and tell her, like, no, I just took a couple of extra Ativan, so I'm probably just really out of it. He says, I'm super tired. Honestly, I'm really just tired. And then he hangs up the phone on her. Apparently, this really concerned Vicky, and she tried to call Chris back multiple times, but he didn't answer. Some reports say that after this, she called the hotel, and she was trying to explain to the hotel that they needed to go check on her husband and told them that he wasn't answering the phone and was trying to get their help. And according to Vicky, they actually hung up the phone on her, which I couldn't imagine they would do that unless she was being like super crazy and not making any sense. I don't know if she even did that at all. So because she wasn't having any luck with the front desk at the hotel, she decided to call Martin Kirsten, whom I guess she had his phone number, and she called him up and said, hey, I don't know what's going on with Chris. He's not answering his phone. He was acting really weird earlier on the phone. He sounded like he was super out of it. I'm really worried about him. Please just go check on him. At 12:15, Martin Kirsten finally shows up at Chris Cornell's hotel room. He actually has a key card because he's his bodyguard. So he tries to use his key card, but realizes, okay, well, shoot, there's the deadbolt lock is on, like the little bar that you put on the door so you can open it a little bit. So he finds a phone nearby in the hallway and calls down to the front desk and says, yo, like, I'm trying to get into this room, and I think that the guy that I'm working for might be in trouble, might need some help. So can somebody please come up and open this door? And basically what they tell him is, not your room, not your problem. We can't do anything for you because it's not your room, man. It's like, okay, well then fine. I'm going to kick this door down and cause damage to your hotel. Sorry. And so that's what he does. While still on the phone with Vicky Cornell, he kicks this door in. Apparently a few times he has to kick it, and finally just busts the little metal piece off the door and breaks that latch. From there, he runs inside. He sees that there's a second door into the bedroom that is also locked. And honestly, I didn't even realize that these doors had locks to the bedrooms. Like, once you're in the hotel, I thought that all those doors were just like regular doors. They didn't lock at all. But apparently this one did lock. Although the pictures that I found don't show that there's locks on the doors in the pictures anyway. So I don't know. Regardless, there's a second locked door. And instead of being like, all right, I already kicked down one door, I'm just going to go ahead and take the initiative and kick this door down, no questions asked. No. He takes that opportunity to call back down to the front desk again to ask them to unlock the second door, to which they respond that they can't get there quickly enough, so he just proceeds to kick that second door in. Once he gets that second door kicked in, which this guy must be an absolute beast to be able to kick through not only a hotel like main door, those things are thick with 2 C's, but he also kicks down the second bedroom door. Once he runs in, he finds Chris Cornell. He can see his legs through the bathroom door, which is cracked open. He rushes over and notices that Chris is actually dangling by one of those stretchy workout bands, and it's wrapped around his neck, and then it's thrown over the top of the door. Now, in his official police report, what Martin says is that when he looked over, he could see in the bathroom his legs were on the floor, so he rushed over to find Chris Cornell on the floor with a red band around his neck. He goes further to say that he took that opportunity to take the red band off of the top of the door and loosen it from around his neck so that he could start performing CPR. Now, let me remind you, this was at 12:15 this all started happening. At 12:56, a hotel employee, not even Martin Kirsten, calls 911 to let them know that they have a guest who's unresponsive who might have tried to self-exit.
Thursday, May 18th, 2017. The time, 12:56 a.m.
Detroit 911. What is the address of the emergency?
1777 3rd Street, the MGM Casino.
And the callback number?
313-465-1100. What did they say? I need 21.
Tell me exactly what happened.
I have non-responsive guest in a hotel. It's going to be a 50-year-old male inside of room 1136.
Okay, non-responsive. He's not breathing.
No.
Is anyone doing CPR?
They're getting up there. Did they start CPR? Okay, so they found out that the guest was attempting to hang himself, so they're trying to get him down so they can assist with CPR.
Okay, I'll request units.
Okay, can I get your operator number, please?
19.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the same time at 12:56 that on-site medical staff from the hotel show up and take over from Martin, giving him CPR. The first thing they do, though, is they take the red workout band completely off from around his neck, because apparently Martin hadn't even taken it completely off. It was still around his neck, and he's trying to give him CPR. But this person supposedly takes over on the CPR and tries to continue resuscitating him. And then another official emergency medical responder shows up at 1:30, and somebody had posted, it seems like they were just constantly monitoring like Detroit radios for emergency medical stuff. I'm not sure why, but they posted this like 9-hour long clip. I guess it's not a clip, 9-hour long marathon of radio transmissions. And towards the end of it, that you actually get to hear the radio transmission that came through of the medical team that had finally responded to Chris Cornell's scene.
84 Alpha 142 receiving. How do you copy?
Loud and clear, go ahead.
I'm on scene with a 53-year-old male, pulseless and happy on arrival of crew. Unknown downtime, found by roommate in a hotel at MGM. The patient did have a exercise rubber band around his neck. Suggestions of possible strangulation, trauma to the back of the head, history of depression. Patient is cool to the touch in all areas at this time. Pulse has been on scene over 30 minutes time. At the end by car. Pupils are fixed and dilated. IO in the right knee, ligature marks on his neck. We have established a patent airway, ET tube. I'm sorry, that was a dual lumen combi tube. We're not able to resuscitate him at this time, so we're asking for pronouncement.
That's going to be 0133, Dr. Sweeney.
81 Alpha 142 copies, 0130, Dr. Sweeney. Over.
Now, once this medical team arrives, it's about 1:30, and they officially pronounce Chris Cornell no longer with us. However, one of the interesting things that we hear him say is that he has a laceration on the back of his head. Now, this is the first of many eerie discrepancies that are just going to raise tons of questions. The laceration on the back of his head was never mentioned, not one time, not even remotely, in the official autopsy report. There is zero mention of this laceration, which is weird. However, there is another document that was submitted from a medical examiner who sent in their report, and this report does talk about this laceration, as well as the person who was on an unbiased radio transmission that isn't being seen or heard by anybody else other than people within the medical emergency response teams, and they say that there's a laceration to the back of their head. The other thing that's very strange that we hear is that they relay the information that Chris Cornell has a history of depression and mental health struggles, and that's kind of an interesting thing. The only way that they would know about that is if somebody close to him told him that. And the only person that was there that was close to him was the bodyguard. And why would he feel the need to say this to these random medical response people? Maybe telling them what prescriptions he took, or maybe telling them anything about his actual physical medical history would be much more relevant than just being like, yo, the guy that looks like he kind of himself has a history of, ideation about this stuff. A little after 4 a.m. that same day, it seems like the official police report was all concluded. They had their final decision and their final investigation was completed into what actually happened, and they officially ruled it a self-exit. Media, tabloids, everybody was pushing this narrative and really highlighting and focusing on how Chris Cornell struggled with addiction issues, how there was pills found in the room, and not only that, but he also had a history of intense depression. So they're just trying to add and feed with this mainstream narrative all of these things that will lead people to believe like, oh, this makes sense. He had a history of depression. He had a history of drug use. And then they found drugs in his hotel room. Of course, he lost control, he relapsed, and then he ended it all. And that's what they wanted you to believe with Avicii. And that's what they wanted you to believe with Chester Bennington. And yet, something's just off, you guys. Something just doesn't seem right in all of these cases, but mostly in Chris Cornell's case. When you see the photos of this crime scene, you're like, wait, what? That does not look like your typical self-exit scene, especially because of the fact that there's blood everywhere. Now, there's quite a few discrepancies and interesting facts that I want to point out about this crime scene. And so the first thing I wanted to start with was the lacerations to his head, because those are never mentioned outside of this medical examiner's report and the medical guy who showed up saying that it was there. Nobody else ever talks about it. But that is a pretty good indication that he was hit on the head with something. The other thing that was very important about all of this, like I mentioned, is the amount of blood. There was blood all over the floor, and not only on the floor, it looked like there was a blood splatter, like he had coughed up blood onto the wall at one point. I looked into this because I was curious, like, is it normal for you to bleed this much if you have yourself? And no, it's not. It's 100% not normal. It is sometimes the case where like a little bit of blood might come out of your mouth, maybe a little bit, but mostly your neck being cut off, any circulation, it's going to restrict a lot of the blood flow. So unless there's some sort of trauma to that area in your throat, in your mouth, or maybe in your lungs, then you're not going to be spitting up any blood. And there wasn't any trauma to Chris's lungs or his general chest cavity area until supposedly they performed CPR. Chris had 9 broken ribs. And yes, it is normal for you to have ribs broken during CPR, but typically that only happens in about 30% of cases with people who have a lot more fragile bodies. Chris was 6'3", 180 pounds. He was a decent sized dude. And he was 52 when he passed away, so he wasn't, real old. He wasn't real young. I wouldn't say he was in his prime, but he's certainly not a fragile, delicate body. And one of the other things that I read that people pointed out was the fact that Chris is a singer, so the main muscles he's using on a regular basis are his chest muscles, his diaphragm, his chest cavity in general. So I'm sure he had stronger than most muscles in that area. So for him to have had 9 broken ribs, when typically when people do see broken ribs, they maybe see like 4 to 6 broken ribs. The typical amount, though, is 2 to 3 ribs being broken. And 9 ribs is like half of your rib cage. That's crazy. I think you have like 9 on one side. I don't know how many ribs you have total, but I'm pretty sure that's like half of your ribs. And we talked about this last week with Chester Bennington. Chris Cornell's feet were on the floor. In fact, multiple reports say multiple different things. Some reports say that he was still suspended partially from the door when Martin arrived. Other reports say that Martin said he found him on the ground. Now, when I say that something's on the ground, like, oh yeah, I fell and hit the ground, I don't mean that I'm partially suspended and my feet are touching the ground. When you say that something's on the ground, it's freaking on the ground. So Martin was saying that Chris Cornell was on the ground when he found him. And he also said that the door was open when he walked in. After he kicked in that second bedroom door, he said that the bathroom door was open. How did he get this workout band to hang over the door if the door was open? The way that these workout bands even work is that the door has to be closed.
If you're not familiar with Chris Cornell, he supposedly hung himself with this red exercise band. And while this is quite possible, we decided to do our own testing. We bought one of the highest resistance bands that you can buy over the counter and tried it out ourselves. After measuring this door, we get 6 foot 8 inches. The person on the right here is 5'9", 160 pounds, and if Chris was standing next to him, he would stand here at 6'3", 180 pounds. Now let's see what happens. This person described this choking to be very painful, but at the same time it wasn't enough to choke him out to make him pass out. As you can see, he has quite a bit of slack. If Chris was sitting next to him, he would have even more slack. What we learned during this experiment is if you twist the handle around the rope when it's around your neck, once the body goes limp, the rope will slide out of the loop, so it has to be strictly based on body weight alone to effectively choke yourself out. We also tried other forms and other positions to try to hang yourself effectively with this red band. This person said this was excruciatingly painful. This would be a more likely scenario for Chris, but at the crime scene there was no blood where he would have been hanging if he took this position. Instead, this is what it looked like. As you can see here, Chris did bleed from the mouth at one point. But even more interesting is that down here you can see blood droplets, as if it was being slowly dripped. It's very likely that Chris was either hanging or sitting down on the ground and being strangled by some kind of rope or device. And maybe his back was against the door with his head cocked as blood was dripping from his mouth.
And if you look at these photos, it looks like the workout band was placed over the door, and the carabiner that was connecting the band to the actual handle strap thing was wedged in between the door trying to get it closed. But if the door was open, then it doesn't make any sense that it was ever closed. Maybe what happened was somebody put it over the door and tried to close the door to make it look like that was what happened, but they were unsuccessful because that carabiner was too big to fit between the door and the frame. So that's what ended up leaving this door looking all smashed on this side like it is. One of the videos I watched pointed out that the fact that this smash had to come from some sort of pressure pulling down on the other side of this band, because this photo was taken on the other side of the door from where Chris was found. So if the door was open, then it would make sense that those cuts into the door were caused by the workout band being pulled by the handle from the other side, trying to essentially put lots of tension on the other end of the band, asphyxiating him. Not only were all of his ribs broken, but he had blood found in his lungs during the autopsy report. And unfortunately and frustratingly, they said that that was consistent with the official cause of death. But it's not. There's no way that that would happen unless there was some sort of serious trauma to the inside of his body that caused blood to seep into his lungs. And likely that was because he probably got beat up. To go along with this whole feet on the floor thing, there was scratches found on Chris Cornell's neck, and there was another medical examiner who actually did a kind of a follow-up report and kind of just did his own, research and did his own analysis of this autopsy report. And what he found was that due to these scratches on his neck, it showed that he had regulation of his airway or of the tension that was going on with this band. Basically saying that he could stand up, he could regulate the tension that was on this band, so he was not the one controlling it. Somebody else was controlling it, but he was able to try and get this band off of his neck, and that's why there's these scratch marks around his neck. Because a workout band is like a nice soft silicone rubber. It's at best going to leave like a kind of like a burn mark, but it's not going to leave intense scratching on your neck. So it's led a lot of people, including this Werner Spitz guy, to believe that there had to be foul play involved because Chris was trying to actively avoid strangulating himself, suffocating. Also, his feet were on the floor. And what's with the blood? But say Chris is unresponsive by the time that Martin shows up. Martin supposedly has been doing CPR from roughly, we'll say 12:30, 12:35, once he actually gets all these doors busted in. And then at 12:56, we know for sure there's an actual on-site hotel medical person doing CPR. So if nothing else, if Martin wasn't actually performing CPR, at least somebody was in there doing it by 12:56. However, at this point, Chris Cornell's been unresponsive since before 12:15. I looked it up. The typical length of time that medical staff will perform CPR before deciding that it's not actually going to do anything is about 15 to 20 minutes. According to this autopsy report, they performed CPR for an hour on a guy who never had a pulse. So though I can appreciate the effort, it doesn't necessarily make any sense to me. Also, I'm not fully convinced that Martin was actually performing CPR, especially knowing he didn't even remove the band from his neck. Also, yet again, he says he took the band off the top of the door and lowered Chris, but he also says that he found Chris on the floor. So what is it? Also, how is this workout band even still pinned in between the door if the door was open? How is this thing? It's just floating up there? What's going on? So if we think about the fact that if he was actually found on the ground as opposed to hanging from the door actively, it would make more sense that there was a second person who was pulling on the other end of that band, on the other end of that door, causing that indentation in the other side of the door. And then when they were done, they let go and got out of that room. Now, I will say this. Police did a thorough investigation into the video surveillance footage of that hallway and his room and that area, and they confirmed that there was nobody who went in or out of that room outside of Chris Cornell and Martin Kirsten, which is what has led everybody to believe that this bodyguard, number one, his story doesn't match, doesn't make any sense. He's got a lot of holes in it. But then number two, he was the last person to see Chris Cornell alive and the first person to see him unalive. He's a number one suspect. And in a lot of the cases that I've covered, we see it in the Kim Porter case. Diddy was trying to get her phone. In the Chester Bennington case, we talked about how his passcode was needed to enable Face ID, like somebody was trying to get into his phone. With Aaron Carter, his phone was not even close to him, even though he was taking a bath and always on his phone. They found it in his RV in the driveway. In Chris Cornell's case, they didn't even recover his phone. And that's on the official autopsy report. Phone not recovered, nor was his laptop. And we know he was using his phone because he called both his bodyguard and supposedly he talked to his wife Vicky on the phone. So how were they speaking to him if he didn't have a phone, but there was no phone ever recovered? What the F happened to it? And what's with all the weird stuff with the phones? They just got to go through and delete all the stuff they don't want seen, or like, who knows? But there's always something going on with the phone. But this Martin Kirsten guy, he's a number one suspect in my book, in a lot of people's books, really. But who is this guy? Where did he come from? Why is he here guarding Chris Cornell? Well, he's originally from South Africa. He got into trouble a lot when he was younger, so his mom decided that the best way to straighten him out and get him on the right path was to enlist him in the South African military. And then once he got out, he decided to move up to the United States. Now, Martin's pretty fit, and when he was younger, after getting out of the South African military, he decided he wanted to be a personal trainer, and he figured he had a better shot of going up to the U.S. because that's where people are more, concerned and interested in personal training services. So he decided to head up to California, and he was going to become a personal trainer. But what he realized when he got there was that you could literally throw a rock and hit a personal trainer anywhere you go in California, especially with it being like the fitness capital of the world. At the same time, him and a friend were actually running a supplement store that was right across the street from a gym. And the two of them were really stoked about this idea and thought it would be perfect. But it was right around the same time when Amazon started blowing up. And people were like coming in to find the best protein powders or the best this or that. And they would give them their advice, and then they'd be like, oh, I got to go get some money. I got to go back. I'll be back later. I'll come back tomorrow. And then they would likely just go buy it online because everything was cheaper online and it would ship to your door within a week, 3 days. So it didn't really help their business model out. And unfortunately, that business would shut down. And he was left really, really desperate looking for some way to make money. Outside of personal training, one of the other things he was inspired to do was to become a cop. In South Africa, they didn't have the same rigid rules and regulations that we have here in the U.S., so it really motivated him to appreciate what they do and what police officers, provide for society. So he thought it would be a good next step for him, plus he had the military background. But his green card wouldn't allow him to actually go through the police academy. In order to become a police officer, you actually have to be a citizen. So he was still 2 years away from being able to achieve citizenship, and so in the meantime, he figured... His buddy told him, why don't you go down and there's a security job. You can apply to be a security guard. You can get licensed and do that for a couple of years, build your resume up. And then after the 2 years is up, then you can go into the academy. So that's what he did. He started working as a security guard, doing like overnight shifts, door guy stuff, just basic stuff. And over time, the company he was working with, he eventually worked his way up and was working with higher end clients and working with people like Heidi Klum. Now, he started off as her bodyguard, but by the end of it, the two of them were dating. And that lasted about a year and a half before Martin actually called it quits. Can you imagine this Ophi Martin guy calling it quits on Heidi Klum And the reason he says he called it off was because he felt like he was just a stay-at-home daddy, stay-at-home babysitter, basically, while she was off working and traveling and doing what she had to do to maintain her career. He was at home watching all of her kids and getting them to school and just taking care of the house, and he was just really sick of it. He went from being a tough military man bodyguard to being stay-at-home dad, and he wasn't okay with it. When the two of them split up, she actually bought him and his mom a house, and she bought him a car. And he says that one of the reasons why she was constantly spoiling him like this and taking him out to dinner and just making sure that he was well taken care of was to keep him quiet. And I didn't really understand that reference. I didn't know if he meant something like serious or if just keep him quiet from like whining and complaining about the situation he was in. I don't really know. But either way, she dropped a lot of money on this dude. But in all my research, I was trying to figure out, who did this guy work for? And in the official police report, it actually says that he works for Battalion Protection Group. So when I looked into that, turns out he actually is the president, owner, sole operator of Battalion Protection Group. So he started his own security business and kind of did his own thing. But before that, he was working for an actual security company. This company is called, that includes politicians, athletes, people in the entertainment industry, celebrities, just the wealthy elite. I looked for a client list of his former clients, couldn't really find any. The only one that you can really pull up is Heidi Klum and Chris Cornell. He did work for this Gavin DeBecker and Associates, and these guys have ties to a lot of political parties. One of the interesting things I did find, however, was that the reason he was let go was because he had a breach of his contract. This security company actually came back and sued him for a breach of this contract. The weird thing about everything to me was that the company, Gavin DeBecker, actually dropped the whole lawsuit for some reason. In the midst of everything, they just dismissed everything and dropped it all. It makes me wonder if maybe they were like, hey, we'll drop this lawsuit and drop all this stuff if you will at least make yourself available as a private security mercenary guy for when we need you. Perhaps they recruited him to be in their handler network. And the reason I felt like he just had to be a handler was because of how he handled this entire situation. I mean, he busted into this room at 12:15 and there was no police notified until 12:56. Literally 45 minutes went by. Chris Cornell was unresponsive that entire time and he didn't think to call the police. And yet he was real quick to call the front desk asking him if he could kick a second door down, which literally makes no sense. And then on top of everything else, he has, varying statements to police. And the only statements to police that were taken by anybody was from Martin Kirsten and Vicky Cornell over the phone. And these statements were never verified. They were never checked into. They didn't do any sort of verification to make sure that what they said was actually true. They just said, oh, okay, it sounds good. Cool. It's a crazy situation, man. Also, the pictures that I found show very clearly 2 prescription bottles that were found in Chris Cornell's room. But the official report given by Martin says that he was the one who gave Chris 2 Ativan. But then when Chris was talking to his wife, he says that he took too many Ativan. But 2 Ativan is not more than too many. It's the actual normal dosage. So what is going on? None of this makes any sense at all, literally at all. The thing that got me the most with all of this was that the toxicology report came back, and when it did, news media took full advantage of trying to push this narrative that there was all of these different drugs in his system. But there wasn't. The ones that were in his system were all prescription medications that were prescribed to him. One of them was the Narcan that the medical people actually injected him with because they thought maybe he was ODing on something. And then he had caffeine in his system, and he had the Ativan in his system. That was pretty much it. The only thing in his system that didn't really make any sense, he ended up testing positive for butalbital, which is a barbiturate. He did have a history of having an issue with barbiturates, but none of the medication that he had any barbiturates in it. So he had no way of taking any barbiturates. But the combination of the Ativan with the barbiturates could have led to him completely being out of it, like people say he was. And it's very likely that maybe Martin Kirsten snuck him something other than Ativan when he gave him these 2 Ativan pills. Or maybe a little something extra on top of those little Ativan pills. Who knows? But the fact that this stuff was in his system and he didn't take anything else that would lead to it being in his system, where did this stuff come from? But the fact that the news media is so heavily focused on, oh, he had drugs in his system, he must have just lost it because he was relapsing. Like, no, That's not what happened. Not even a little bit. In fact, Chris was happy, healthy, sober, and he was a family man. And if it doesn't show you how focused on his family and doing good things in the world he was with all of the humanitarian efforts, him taking that long break from music to really focus on his family and his kids, him giving up his addictions to be a better dad for his kids and his family, I don't think that this guy was trying to end it. I really don't. And it really just raised the question for me of, was this guy Martin Kirsten hired to protect him, or was he hired to silence him? Who hired this guy? It's actually said that Chris Cornell didn't even like this guy. And a lot of sources say that Vicky's the one that hired him to be his security for this tour, but he wasn't their normal security guy. He was just a security guy they hired to join him on this tour, and that was that. It wasn't like a personal friend or someone recommended. I'm not sure how they found this guy. I couldn't figure it out. There's no information about him, which is even more suspicious in my opinion, because this guy would be the number one suspect, and yet the media is leaving him completely alone. He just did a regular ass interview not very long ago in like 2020, and he seems like he's doing pretty normal stuff. He's got some rhino, like Save the Rhinos Foundation, where he's, speaking out against people who poach rhinos to steal their horns. Like, I don't know, just seems like he's carrying on pretty normally. There's just so many weird things about this guy. I don't know. And you can't find any information on him. And when I looked him up on Truthfinder, there's no information about any of his security jobs. The only thing about his security you can find is the fact that he did get licensed as a security guard, and he's licensed to carry a firearm. But besides that, he's got all these other nutrition businesses, and that's really all you can find financially about him. So you can't see who he's worked for, and that's what made me feel really uneasy about this, security company he was working for. They represent such high-profile clients that they don't even really exist out there. Like, you can't find information on who they represent or who these people work for or who they've had as clients. Just very strange, very secrety. And it made me believe that they are working for really elite people, like the Clintons, the Epstein kinds of folks. You know what I'm talking about. But because I couldn't find real ties with this whole Silent Children project, I couldn't find real proof that these guys definitively were all working on this project together and trying to get this thing pushed out. So I was looking for other connections between them, trying to see, what is a connection between all three of these guys? They're all in music, and they were all involved in very similar circles and kind of promoting the same ideas and stuff. But was there any direct links between them? And the one that I found was a fairly interesting one in my opinion, especially for my red pill folk out there. But it's the fact that all of these guys were on labels that were at one point or another somehow connected to David Geffen. Interscope with Linkin Park, Warner Records with Avicii, and then A&M Records for Chris Cornell. Eventually, Warner Music would absorb Interscope and A&M Music, and they would all kind of fall under the same umbrella. And David Geffen obviously owns Geffen Records as well, but all of that got bought out by Warner Records, and then David Geffen was just operating underneath the Warner Records parent label. So all of these guys at one point or another were working underneath David Geffen. David Geffen is a very powerful music figure. He also has been tied to the digital entertainment network trafficking scandal, where they were actually hiring underage boys to come in, and they were using these boys. They were exploiting them, basically. And though David Geffen wasn't directly involved with what was happening, he was funding the entire project. So even though there's no evidence to show that he was directly involved, it seems like he likely was, especially with the allegations outside of that have come out about David Geffen. He seems very interested in younger males. So I don't know. It's just an interesting connection that I was able to find between all three of them, and something that I could imagine David Geffen probably has friends in high places as well. I'm sure he rubs shoulders with very important people, and so who knows what was really getting out about what these guys were looking into with the whole human trafficking stuff. I mean, David Geffen at the end of the day does stand to earn from all of these guys passing, because the labels that they are on will eventually earn money based on these artists passing away. People want that nostalgia. People want to listen to them. People want to, buy their album to keep it as a keepsake, to remember where they were at when they listened to it, all this stuff. So when we look at who stood to gain from all of these guys passing away, I mean, obviously the record labels, because once they pass, that music is just going to keep earning. And not only that, these guys had tons of music in their arsenal that they could release after they were gone. And once an artist passes away, their sales and their downloads and streams, they skyrocket. So the record label stood to gain. Maybe this Martin Kirsten guy was actually a handler. Maybe he was getting paid. I mean, the dude's a mercenary. That's what that means, literally. So maybe that's what it was. Maybe he was benefiting from just completing a job and getting paid. Also, Vicky Cornell. She benefited because literally everything from Chris, that whole estate, all that stuff goes into his name. She's honestly been fighting and suing people over all kinds of stuff. And one saying that because of their product, it led to her husband no longer being here. And she actually won. That's crazy to me. Not only that, but she's also been fighting over music rights and royalty rights with Soundgarden. And she's been fighting with Chris Cornell's ex, Susan Silver, trying to just keep her from getting any money, even though they also had a child together. So she's entitled to at least a piece of things. But Vicky's just been fighting everybody when it comes to money. So maybe she stood to gain from Chris Cornell passing, and she helped set all this up, and she was a part of the whole plot. And one of the biggest pieces that leads people to think that is the fact that she immediately cremated Chris Cornell before anything else could be done. Once the autopsy was finished and everything else was done, immediately cremated. Even if there was any evidence or possible reinvestigation that could be done, the body's gone. And I guess there's just two last things that I really wanted to mention. And the first one is that none of these guys left a note. None of them. Chris Cornell had 3 children, literally, and he was a family man. He was a very dedicated family man. And he's literally just going to give him the middle finger like that? Just like Chester Bennington supposedly did to his 6 kids. And Avicii didn't have kids, but he had family and friends and people who cared about him, and he didn't leave a note either. Literally doesn't make any sense to me. If I was going to off myself, I would definitely be leaving a note, just to let people know why, or that this is what happened. So keep that in mind, viewers, because if I turn up, and there's no note, and my feet are on the floor, there was foul play. He can regulate the tension on his neck. He could stand up. He could do anything to avoid meeting the fate that he did, unless there was somebody else involved. And shoot, maybe he was trying really hard to get that band off of his neck, but he was so out of it from the barbiturates and the Ativan that he was given that he just couldn't even do it. He was just super helpless. But one thing's for sure, Chris Cornell left a lasting impact on the world. His music is timeless. Soundgarden will forever live in rock and roll history as the band that brought grunge to the mainstream. He was able to speak out on addiction issues and help others find sobriety and help others in the way that he so desperately needed help. He was a huge source of funding for multiple different humanitarian efforts and aid programs, and he was a huge outspoken advocate against human trafficking, raising awareness and just helping people in these awful exploitative situations. So the lasting legacy that Chris Cornell has left is amazing. Not only will Chris Cornell go down as an amazing member of rock and roll history, but he will also go down as just an amazing human being who did a lot to speak up and stand up for people who really needed help. But as always, I really want to know what you guys think, because you guys always hit me with some knowledge. You guys always know some that I don't know. And I'm just curious what you guys think about all this, especially in how it ties in with Avicii and Chester Bennington, because it's all very interesting, all very peculiar. And especially with this episode, I feel like it's more obvious than ever that there was foul play involved. But drop it in the comments. Let me know what you think. But if you can't get enough sobering stories, you just love the sound of my voice, then go ahead and click on this Sobering Stories playlist right here, and you can just watch every single one I've ever done. If you're really interested in all the Diddy videos I've done, I know I talked about a couple of them in this one. I'm going to go ahead and link that Diddy Do It playlist right now. And if you just, you're real submissive and you like being told what to do, then take YouTube's recommendation. It's going to put it right here. But if you haven't subscribed, I'm not sure why you're still here watching this video and you haven't subscribed, but if that's you, click this one right here. It's a little subscribe button. It's going to make sure that every Friday it notifies you about a new video. But otherwise, I really appreciate you guys sitting and hanging out with me for this long, listening to Chris Cornell's story and just listening to me talk. But I look forward to doing this again with you guys next week. It's a date, and we'll do another one. But until then, later, sobers.
Let's go.